Hi, another Friday and another reading from my book, The Little Stranger at Your Door. This week's story is about Amnesty. You've probably heard about the good work that Amnesty do. So I'll begin. At the end of Mass one Sunday morning, I was idly looking through the week's church news sheet when my eye was caught by the following. There'll be a meeting of Amnesty International on Thursday this week to form a group of supporters in the local area. Would you like to come along? This had instant appeal for me, as I'd always wanted to know exactly how international Amnesty worked to release religious or political prisoners of conscience. Arriving at the meeting, there were probably 2 or 3 dozen in the audience and 3 speakers. I was fascinated to hear of the dedication of its members in the cause of supporting and releasing those in prison for their beliefs. I'd gone along curious to know how the system works and to possibly help by writing letters to heads of government, prisons, etc., to pressurise them into reconsidering the imprisonment of these individuals, as letters of protest were at the heart of the work that Amnesty International do. I was therefore surprised when, during the usual routine of electing individuals for certain roles, I found my name being suggested as media person. Despite me shaking my head, it was seconded by another, much to my dismay. I asked the panel what duties this role would bring and was told that I would represent Amnesty when required for interviews for TV, radio or the press. Oh, I couldn't possibly do that, I said. I'm more of a backroom person, but will happily write reams of letters if necessary. Unhesitatingly, the speaker informed me, "Don't worry, only when a prisoner is released would you be interviewed. And we haven't even got our own prisoner yet. It will be at least a year before we have one." "That's fine then, I'll happily accept that role," I told them. I then settled into hearing about the case of a released prisoner, released because of the letters written by Amnesty International. The prisoner, husband and father, imprisoned because of his religious beliefs, had become a non-person in prison, was simply a number, no name and no clothes of his own. He'd been in prison for some years when letters from Amnesty began to arrive to the governor and the heads of state. It was several hundred letters later that he was given his name back and finally his own clothing. In time he was released and left the country for the UK, where he was reconciled with his wife and children and settled in London. I left the meeting in awe of what had been achieved by peaceful negotiating means and looked forward to being part of the letter writing. I vaguely remembered a mention at that meeting that the 25th anniversary of the inception of Amnesty International was coming up quite soon, but didn't connect that fact with a phone call I'd had from a local radio 3 or 4 weeks later. The caller said, "I understand that you're the media representative for Amnesty International." "That's correct," I told him. He went on to say, "As it's the 25th anniversary of Amnesty, we're doing a live programme on Sunday and we'd like you to come along for a discussion." "Oh, I can't possibly do that as I'm a very new member with no experience," he said. "That will be no problem for you, as the area member, Dr. X, will be leading the discussion. There will also be another member there too." Still unsure, there didn't seem to be good reason not to attend. "Okay, can you tell me where and what time then, please?" Having accepted the invitation, in other words, having committed myself to making an appearance, an unexpected phone call 48 hours before the programme was to go on air threw me into a quandary. "Mrs. Necchi, we're looking forward to you appearing on the programme, raising the awareness of Amnesty International. But just to let you know of a minor change, Dr. X, the main leader, has unfortunately fallen sick and is unable to attend. Nevertheless, I can assure you that the programme is still going ahead." "Oh dear, I'm quite worried now, as I have scant knowledge or experience of Amnesty, nor do I like public speaking." He tried to reassure me, saying, "As I told you a few days ago, there's nothing to worry about, as another representative will be there." How could I refuse and leave a lone interviewee at the radio station? Gird up your loins and go for it, I told myself. I had to have a plan of action. Write a script for myself and take it along to the studio, just in case I was asked to say a few words. It was a miserable, rainy and windswept evening as I arrived at the radio station at Drive. It could have been the setting for a ghost or horror movie. The door opened automatically in response to my bell, but there was no sign of life in this dark reception hall. The eerie silence was broken by the shrill sound of a telephone at the desk ringing. It echoed around until I felt obliged to pick it up, anticipating that it was my interviewer calling. Hello. The voice at the other end. Do you know what the footy result was between Arsenal and Everton? Oh, sorry I don't. Can you call back later? Obviously, a local radio station. The public expected that sports results were readily available to its listeners. I was only too happy in this spooky building to speak to another human, albeit one probably miles away. Eventually a man appeared and asked me to follow him through narrow black painted passageways to a small studio at the top of the house. In the middle stood a black painted octagonal table with a series of microphones evenly attached around the edges. Now a friend who knew I was paranoid at the idea of coming face to face with a microphone had reassured me that modern microphones are tiny and concealed on the skirting boards. Another fright or flight situation, but no opportunity for flight now. I felt trapped in an upper dark chamber, a surreal situation. But remembering the notes I'd made, clutched in my trembling hand, I took a seat at the table, joined by the second guest who'd just arrived. I told him, "I'm so glad you made it, as I'm a new member, not really the right person to be interviewed." He answered, "I've been a member for only 3 months." We both fell silent, and as directed by the interviewer, watched the enormous clock on the studio wall tick the minutes and seconds to the start of the interview. Quick as a flash, I placed my notes on the table. Sorry, Mrs. Necchi, please don't use notes, it takes away the spontaneity." As I watched the seconds tick away, I had some understanding of the prisoner awaiting her hangman. The bright voice of the interviewer announced, "Can I introduce Mrs. Necchi, who's come along to speak to us on the 25th anniversary of the Amnesty International. Mrs. Necchi, can you tell the listeners why you joined Amnesty?" All I could do was to speak from the heart, remembering how impressed I'd been by the letter writing which had achieved the release of the prisoner. I began, "I've been a member of Amnesty for a very short time, but can relate to why I decided to join." I repeated the story I'd heard at the meeting about a prisoner of conscience who was held captive for years and who, after hundreds of letters, was released. I ended my piece by adding that the power of the pen is mightier than the sword. Driving home, I couldn't believe that I'd survived what for me was an ordeal. Maybe ridiculously, I thought I might even have a heart attack in the studio. So it was with great relief that when I went home to my 2 waiting sons, expecting those to be equally relieved for me, I walked in the house saying, "Well, was I all right?" The boys, engrossed in a TV programme, looked up absent-mindedly. "Sorry, Mum, we forgot to listen." Thank you very much for joining me. Hope you'll join me next week.